Okay, so we've obviously, even though a lot of controversy about the specifics of what's going on in the world, the reality is pretty clear that we've got a lot of work cut out for us. Let's put it that way, at the very least. And this is kind of my best effort to really distill the challenges into a kind of a nutshell. So first of all, for the first time in human history, we know this is the first time we've achieved a truly global interdependent society. So there's been lots of empires and of course, thousands and thousands of years of different tribes and all of that. But we've never had anything like today where we're deeply interdependent around the entire world. It's becoming more and more of almost a monoculture, you might say, in many ways. Obviously, there's still a lot of diversity in there, but we've become so interdependent. And in addition to that, our growth and consumption has gone up more or less exponentially for quite a while now. And as exponential curves go, right, they get steeper and steeper, at least until they hit some kind of tipping point. And having almost 8 billion humans on the planet with increasing consumption, understandably, we've caused a lot of harm and imbalance to the many different living systems. So, climate kind of takes the spotlight, understandably, because it's pretty concerning, but there's so many other living systems as well. The Earth, the terrestrial ecosystems and the ocean systems and the cryosphere, the glacial systems and the poles and on, have taken a real big hit as well. And when we actually look at where we're at now and project it a little bit more in the future, we're looking at, it's already happening, collapse of our habitat. So we're already seeing massive collapse of habitat around the world for many, many species. It's pretty well acknowledged we're at the beginnings of a mass extinction event, often called the sixth mass extinction event. Could be 7, at least from the time of multicellular organisms, it's 6 or 7 anyway. But that's over 1 billion years. So yeah, these don't happen very often, luckily, but it seems to be happening now. And increasing vulnerability to illness and pandemics. So the combination of the interdependent, interconnected nature of human society, and in addition to all the destruction to the wilderness and exploitation of wildlife and animals, creates a huge vulnerability to novel viruses. This particular virus is still somewhat controversial, so instead of going into the politics of that, we do know that just generally exploitation of wilderness and wildlife and animals is a huge contributor to novel flus and viruses, etc. And of course, we're looking already in many parts of the world and big fears about what's happening now with social and economic breakdown. And going further, there's a lot of fears, are we going to join the mass species extinction event ourselves? Are we going to be another species on that list? So we kind of look at the big challenges here. The questions that come to my mind is, first of all, is there any way we can shift this course? It appears like we're heading off a cliff. It seems pretty clear when you do the numbers, no matter how you look at it, the curve can go up so far before something has to give. Can we shift the course, before we go off that cliff? And if so, how can we do that? Collectively and personally, what can little me do about such enormous problems? And regardless of the future, how can we make the best of our situation here and now? So whether or not, we ultimately end up going off the cliff as a human species, we're still here now, and how do we make the best of that, both personally as individuals and collectively? So these are the two big questions I really want to explore. So the first, let's see, sorry, there it is. So in order to answer this question, where are we heading? That's the first question we have to ask before we get into, well, how can we actually shift our trajectory, of course. I'm going to suggest that we start with the past. So in order to look at where we're heading, I think it helps to look at where we come from. And there's a particular concept called emergence, which I think really helps me, and a lot of us really find it super helpful in getting a sense of how we've come to where we are and where we're likely to be going after this point. So I'm going to draw from kind of contemporary Western science creation story, and not everyone subscribes to this. This is just, based on a lot of observations, but it's, it's the best story that Western science has come up with, but it certainly doesn't mean it's fact. There are lots of other creation stories and whatnot. But what I found in a lot of us who kind of look at various myths and creation stories, including the Western version, is there's certain parallels. So whether or not you subscribe to the Western evolution in this particular story, see if there's parallels here that might resonate with your own understanding of creation and where we're at now. So going to the Western story, the idea is the universe as we know it started with the Big Bang, which was essentially from unity to duality, from a state of impossible to comprehend unity, a singularity infinitely dense, suddenly, for who knows what reason, blew into duality, into two opposing forces, expansion and contraction. So it's quite interesting. Again, if you consider other creation stories in the world, there's a similar kind of theme from the one to the many, right? So we see that in this story here, in the Big Bang. And there's a pattern here that I want to, the idea of emergence. So first of all, there's a unity, a holon, as the word we use in systems theory. And the unity disintegrates in some way. It blows apart, breaks down, disintegrates. And it can either then just simply collapse to like a lower state. In this case, with the Big Bang, there isn't the lower state that we know of. Or it can synergize into a new order of complexity, to a new holon. So if we look at evolution from this perspective, you've got the singularity, you've got this explosion of two profound forces of expansion and contraction, and they dance together. And on the microcosmic level, the dance of the attracting and rejecting forces created atoms as we know them. You know, the various positive, negatively charged, and neutral charged subatomic particles, you got atoms. And on the macro layer, we get that dance creates galaxies. So as it expanded from the very early days, the certain areas would kind of coalesce and condense as it continued expanding as a whole, and those condensed areas became galaxies. And within them, they expanded, contracted, into stars. As we see a same kind of dance of these two opposing forces, a thesis and an antithesis, creates a synthesis. That's another way of looking at this called a dialectic, same pattern. So following it up through the layers here, we end up with solar systems. So the stars themselves get more and more complex, and they develop more complex atoms, they blow up into supernovas, etc. And then we get solar systems, right? Rings of planets, ringing, circling, orbiting a star. So that's like the next layer of complexity, like next emergent layer. So for those of you who haven't really studied systems theory, I know I'm throwing a lot of terms, but there's not going to be too many, about 5 or 6 probably new terms. So the idea of emergence, so you have a whole, disintegrates, and then re-synergizes into a higher order of complexity that we call a new holon. And what's so fascinating about emergence is this new order has qualities that did not exist in any of the lower entities at all. It's like entirely novel qualities show up in each order. It's really fascinating, very mysterious from a Western science perspective. We don't really even know what happens, but we know it's like intrinsic in the fabric of life is this creative process. So even though the universe, on the big picture is kind of disintegrating, we call it entropy, and these pockets, there's these threads inside of profound creativity, which leads to evolution and increasing orders of complexity. So then from solar systems, we have planets. And so let's kind of zero in on our own planet, the Earth. So the Earth is really special in many ways. It's just the right distance from the sun so that water is liquid, solid, and gas. It's got virtually all the known complex atoms, elements, which creates basically this extraordinary, from the early days, extraordinary surface of profound dynamic reactivity and dancing amongst all these different forces, you might say. And from that, from that profound reactivity, again, the same kind of basic expansive contracted forces emerged, as far as the story goes, the first life, bacteria, the simplest single-celled organisms. So a new synergy developed, another emergence with, again, totally new properties. And what we seem to find here is properties of actually agency, of empowerment, of some kind of consciousness, or at least a deeper consciousness. And so instead of thinking sort of contraction and expansion as being the contrasting forces, now we've got a sense of agency. We've got living beings which are actually trying to reproduce and proliferate and sort of empower themselves. But at the same time, there's a direction of trying to maintain the status quo. So as the early bacteria spread around the entire planet, a new emergence unfolded, which was Gaia, which we call Gaia, which was the idea of a living biosphere, which is an organism in her own right. And as far as we can tell, it acts just like other living organisms. It self-organizes, it self-maintains her existence, it does her best to thrive, survive. And in many ways, this bacterial network that formed is very much, you could call it like Gaia's brain. So in the same way that all the neurons of our nervous system work together, each individual neuron is an individual kind of organism, has its own sort of agency, but it works together with all the other neurons in our brain to emerge into what we think of as our personal experience that we have here now, personal experience of consciousness and all of that. In the same way, it appears that bacteria interconnected together to create this kind of like Gaia's brain. Really quite fascinating. And then what makes it really interesting when you compare it to now is the bacteria proliferated to the point where they intoxicated themselves, they polluted their environment, they intoxicated themselves to the point of almost extinguishing themselves. They became very close to extinction, ironically, by oxygen, producing too much oxygen for them to be able to handle. They almost died. An emergence happened within them of aerobic bacteria like mitochondria, etc. You don't have to remember all this, but aerobic bacteria, which could actually take the poison oxygen, which was poison at the time, and convert it and make and be able to actually use it for energy. So that was it. And the other thing that happened was the bacteria started to consume each other. They were so desperate from this toxic, overcrowded, overpolluted world. They started consuming each other. And interestingly enough, some of the bacteria survived inside of the others and developed symbiotic relationships. And you develop a nucleated cell. So the next emergence is a nucleated cell, which essentially is lots of bacteria living inside other bacteria and synergizing and working together. And that's what saved the day, you might say. On the edge of extinction, this profound emergence happened and it saved the day. So this was really the first extinction that we know of. We don't even consider it as one of the six because we haven't had complex organisms yet. And then the same thing happened again, apparently. The nucleated cells went along for hundreds of millions of years, and they polluted and overcrowded themselves almost to extinction again. And out of desperation, they started joining forces, and they developed multicellular organisms, animals, plants, and fungus. So as the story goes, again and again, we see crisis to the point of near extinction, and then a profound new synergy unfolds from that into a new order of complexity. And then you continue, carry on, of course, till you get to humankind. And if you look at us from this perspective, right now, we're in a state of disintegration. We've disintegrated profoundly from the whole, from Gaia, from the Gaian system. We've come to this illusory belief that somehow we're separate, we're special, we're different, trying to extract ourselves from Gaia and overcrowding, overpolluting, just like our predecessors. And so the question is, are we actually going to be able to make it to a new synergy? So I'm going to kind of leave us there for just a moment. This takes us to the present. And I'm going to take a moment to go, well, what does all this look like, or I'm sorry, feel like from the inside? So the same creative pattern of what you might call disintegration and new synergy and emergence to another level happens on so many levels throughout every living system and even on an individual basis. So when we look at the human human organism, and our own personal development from a baby onwards is quite fascinating to see the same pattern. So you've got the bottom of the slide, you've got the baby, an infant, and initially the experience, as far as we can tell, is one of profound unity. You know, it's like from the experience of this infant in utero, there isn't really a clear distinction between self and other. It's just kind of like, it's all one, man, you know, this is the world, and I'm part of mom and the world, and there's not really a clear distinction of self yet. But, you know, as it evolves and as it's born, and the experience of self starts to build more and more, there becomes the same kind of dialectic. On one hand, this movement towards fulfilling existence, wanting to survive and thrive and have meaning, and on the other hand, wanting, you know, just peace and unity and security and ease. Most of us can relate to that kind of dynamic going on there. And if all goes well and we're supported by loving parents and all that kind of thing, we develop a secure attachment in the early days. So the very first sort of synergy that we want to develop for a healthy human being is a sense of, I belong here. The world is safe enough. I'm part of this world. I'm welcome in this world. Right? That's a secure foundational attachment. So for those who know attachment theory, we're breaking it into sort of two types of attachment. This is foundational. This is my relationship to the world and to the universe, really. We haven't quite got into the next more complex level yet. Now, if that foundational attachment doesn't really develop well, and we end up with these core beliefs, I don't belong here, the world's hostile, I'm not welcome, I'm a stranger in a strange land. And then carrying on to the sort of next level of development, the increasing experience of self versus other gets stronger and stronger, and we increasingly feel a drive towards a more and more autonomous, empowered self, right? Think of the terrible twos, no, mine, and this kind of really wanting to feel our autonomy and our empowerment. Like we don't want to lose our relational belonging, our love and intimacy and connection with our loved ones. So there's kind of, there's a dialectic that develops. And if all goes well, a new synergy forms of a secure relational attachment now. Now I'm securely attached with my other fellow humans and maybe there's companion animals, etc. And if it goes well, we get the beliefs, I'm loved and valued for who I am, and I love and value others for who they are. And if it doesn't go well, we end up with a limiting belief such as, well, nobody really cares about me, so why should I care about anybody else? So these are different threads that can develop depending on, you could say, the same idea of emergence in our own development. And if you follow developmental psychology further, there's more and more layers, you might say. But these are the most foundational layers. I think you can use the analogy of a tree is quite helpful. The roots, first of all, foundational attachment with the earth, really just the earth and the world in general, the cosmos. And then to other fellow human beings. And again, this is very, the reality is not so black and white, but if you think about it from the perspective of a very diffuse experience of self, and it's just sort of world versus in me, and then it becomes a more clear sense of self, then we get a more clear kind of relational attachment with other people. So just to kind of elaborate slightly on that, so if everything goes well, we achieve foundational and relational secure attachment. These are the beliefs that they're going to be intrinsic to the fiber of my being. I belong here, the world's safe enough, I'm loved for who I am, I love others for who they are. I feel secure connection with my essential self, secure intimacy and interdependence with others. And I just generally feel love, compassion, kindness from this place, and a sense of abundance and generosity. So if all goes really well, this is generally a kind of attitude I'm going to generally hold. And it's going to be kind of with more than just a mental attitude. This is held within the kind of fiber of my being. And if things don't go well, so one or both of these attachments is not secured in some way, then we're likely to develop this kind of experience on our inner world. Right? I don't belong here, the world's hostile, nobody cares about me, so why do I care about anybody else? I feel disconnected from my own essential self. I feel like generally isolated, disconnected from others. There's a general kind of chronic experience of insecurity, fear, hatred, and a general chronic sense of scarcity. There's not enough, discontentment, grief. This goes with the experience of scarcity. So kind of hold this idea of the development of the self. And this is very black and white. Remember, the map is not a territory. This is just a map. Territory is much more complex and nuanced, but it's just helpful to think of these different developmental trajectories that we can take as human beings. And let's expand a little further. One kind of last really important piece I want to bring in here as we're kind of weaving together these different theories is the definition. What do we actually even mean by self? When we say self, what is that? So going back from kind of the earlier slides, we could think, well, the self, it's actually kind of arbitrary in a way to say that the self is just this being right here. So the self called Paris, sure, on some level I can call it self, but when we actually look at the interdependent nature of the whole world and all the living systems, it's really arbitrary to say that that's self, and yet what's outside or inside isn't. We go in, I have individual cells that each have their own sense of agency, and they're individual organisms, but they all work together to create organ systems. And those have their own sense of agency, but they have to work with other organ systems to create this organism here, and et cetera. On up you go to family, society, human species in my case. And then all the species have to work together collaboratively to develop a healthy ecosystem, and then finally the biosphere, all the ecosystems of the earth. And then actually finally the cosmos, right? Of course, the sun and all of that, an important part of even beyond the biosphere. So this is, each of these we call holons, and it's from a systems theory perspective, and a holarchy, couple more terms, right, is the whole package. And distress at any level will actually expand and to cause distress at the other levels, whether it's internal or external. So when we talk about well-being isn't just dependent upon one level of this hierarchy. It actually is very much dependent upon all these other levels as well. So if we,
Tessa?
Yep. Sorry, there's somebody. So if we take this idea a little bit further, the human condition right now, sometimes people sort of in a derogatory way will say, humankind is like a cancer on the earth. But I suggest we kind of leave that attitude aside for a moment and just actually look at it literally, like literally, what is cancer? So from a very generalized way of thinking of cancer, one or more cells, for whatever reason, it forgets it's part of the broader living organism. It somehow loses this connection. It loses its awareness, and it continues to act as an organism, each cell. But what do organisms do? They try to survive and thrive. And since it's no longer connected to the broader living organism, it's going to take in nutrients from the exterior, and it's going to reproduce, but it's not giving anything back now because it doesn't think it's lost connection to the remainder of the organism. So it grows, it becomes a tumor. And it starts to interfere with the larger organism's functioning, and eventually, what does it do? It basically thrives its way to its own demise. And it all started from somehow losing that connection, losing that awareness, on a very simple level, that is part of this larger organism. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, the essence of what happens in cancer. And if you look at humankind, we've done something very similar. It's like we've forgotten that we're part of this larger organism, the ecosystems in the biosphere. And just like a cancer cell would do, we continue trying to survive and thrive. And boy, we're doing great because now we can exploit all the resources out there, but we're not giving anything back, essentially. And so we interfere with the functioning of those broader organisms and living systems, and then eventually, they die, and eventually we thrive our way to our own demise, just like cancer cells would do. So I kind of coined the term a disorder of constricted selfhood. It's like we've developed this disorder of feeling that of hardening the sense of self, either at a personal level, like someone like a sociopath, it's just me, or maybe my family, or maybe my country, or maybe even humans, but it's become very constricted, narrow vision of self. So now I want to put together kind of all those various points that we just brought up and look at where we're at now as a society and individuals within a society. So because our society has become kind of sick in many ways, dysfunctional, disconnected from our essential self, from the other living beings and living systems in many ways, those initial attachments, they get harmed by that. Our foundational attachment, we end up raised in a society that has a very poor, I would say very insecure foundational attachment to our earth. And that leads into very poor relational attachments with each other in many ways. It varies a lot, of course, from person to person and close to society to society. But in general, we're born into a world with very poorly secure, insecure foundational and relational attachments. And when we don't feel connected with others, we, like those cancer cells, we continue trying to survive and thrive, but we're kind of oblivious of the needs of the other. And so that's what we call violence. When I try to meet my needs at the expense of others and by harming others, I'm creating violence. And so we end up causing violence to my own essential self, disconnected from that, other humans, earthlings, and earth, which in turn reinforces further disconnection. And we have this vicious circle in the middle, you might say, on this particular diagram. And then that outer circle is just showing how we're grown in the society, so it creates individuals with this really poor foundational relational attachments, which in turn feed back into the social systems, and round we go. And if you keep it up, essentially it leads to excessive disintegration and our termination, species termination. So what does this mean for our future? Kind of looking at this going back to the holarchy, the expanded vision of self, the whole being. So where do we find ourselves today? It looks like, more than just looks like, it's pretty clear that many of the Earth's ecosystems are collapsing. It's happening all around us, and it's happening at an exponential rate. Many species are already going extinct. It's estimated as high as 50,000 a year are going extinct. It's kind of hard. There's so many species. It's so complex, especially in rainforests and whatnot. But that's the numbers that I've been coming across. As many as 50,000 and growing are going extinct a year. And human society and the biosphere generally, we're starting to see signs of unraveling happening. So if we look ahead in the near future, and there's a lot of controversy about the exact timing of this. Again, very complex systems we're talking about here, but generally speaking, the consensus I've come across within ecologists, climate scientists, etc., are, the ecosystems continue to collapse exponentially along with species. There's a thing called co-species extinction. So one species goes and many other species are dependent on that species, and then they go, and it's like dominoes. It's like dominoes radiating outward in many directions. So the whole thing can really pick up speed really, really quickly. And we're already starting to see that happen in many domains, in various ecosystems. And at a certain point, the food web and habitat required for us, for humankind, will collapse as well. It's just a matter of time. The food web, we have this, where we consume a lot, but it's very, very fragile system, really, dependent upon this, very globalized system of exchange. And it's just a matter of time before that finally gives way. And at that point, global society won't be able to sustain itself and will most likely have to collapse back into smaller tribes and things like that again. And if you continue even further, so if we continue with business as usual, further, it's estimated by the end of the century, there's a really good chance that the biosphere in general will experience a kind of regression. Like, we talked about the emergence into more and more complexity. This is the opposite direction, where many complex organisms won't be able to survive in the biosphere and possibly drop back to a much simpler biosphere, mostly bacteria and insects and things like, or at least certain kinds of insects. Insects are actually on the way out right now as well, many of them, but a lot of the more hardy and resilient creatures and simpler organisms may well survive, but the more complex organisms, including us, probably won't. And that's probably by the end of this century. So the question then is there any hope for us? So going back to this idea of emergence, if you look at where we are now on the right side of this slide here, so humankind has gone from many thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, as one species of many, in this, in Gaia, in this biosphere. And we seem to have a niche that worked really well for a really long time, hundreds of thousands of years. And then really in the space of like 10,000 years, last 10,000 years, there's been some radical changes from a sustainable place in the Gaia system to this increasing experience of constricted selfhood, increasing illusion of being separate from the earth and our fellow earthlings, and then finally to the increasing exploitation, right, of other humans, fellow earthlings, and the earth. More and more in the direction of disintegration, heading off that cliff. But if we look back at what's happened in the past, at other evolutionary phase shifts of the past, there is a possibility. You look at the first bacteria and the first eukaryote, nucleated organisms and stuff, and they each seem to have this crisis where they almost wipe themselves out from pollution and overcrowding, and somehow they manage to to emerge into a more symbiotic and healthy relationship, a new synergy develop. So maybe that gives us some kind of hope. There's a precedent already set. So what would that look like? Well, from self-terminating direction that we're at now to the increasing realization of our interdependence with earthlings and the earth, from ego and anthrocentricity, I and human centricity, to ecocentricity, right? Expanding the experience of self, and finally reclaiming a sustainable place in the Gaia system. That's basically how it would have to look. You would have to kind of retrace our steps in many ways, at least from this broad perspective. Of course, it's not a retracing our steps, because what the past has suggested is you don't go backwards. A crisis happens, a breakdown happens, but it's in the service of breaking through to another level that you can't possibly anticipate from the parts. So from where we're standing now, we can't even know what this could look like. But we do know that it has to include these components. It has to include the increasing realization of our interdependence and sort of reestablishing ourselves into the Gaian system somehow. What that will actually look like is to be seen.